In the dead of winter 2025, the White House declared economic war, not on a distant rival, but on its closest friend. A complex web of tariffs, what we'll call the tariff trap, was sprung on Canada, designed to cripple its industries and force it to its knees. President Trump was expecting a surrender. What he got was a stunning and calculated pivot that left his administration blindsided. Overnight, the world's longest undefended border became a battleground for a new kind of economic warfare. How did Canada, the quieter northern partner, not only escape the trap, but turn the tables on the world's only superpower? For a century, the relationship between the United States and Canada was the envy of the world. It was more than an alliance. It was a single continental factory. Cars, resources, and people flowed across a border that felt more like a seam than a division. In 2024 alone, this partnership accounted for over $760 billion in trade. The supply chains were so deeply intertwined that a single car part might cross the border 6 or 7 times before it ended up in a vehicle sold in Ohio or Alberta. This integration was the bedrock of North American prosperity. It was a promise of stability, of predictability, of a shared future. But that promise was about to be shattered. The very interconnectedness that made both nations strong was about to be weaponized, turning a trusted partner into a strategic target. The foundation of 100 years of friendship was about to be tested like never before. The assault began in the early spring of 2025. This wasn't a single action, but a coordinated campaign, a trap with multiple jaws. On March 26th, the White House dropped the first bombshell, invoking Section 232, a clause meant for national security threats, to slap a crippling 25% tariff on all Canadian-made cars and auto parts. This wasn't a warning shot, it was a direct hit on the heart of the Canadian economy. The promise of protecting American jobs was the official story, but the reality was an attempt to force a complete reshoring of the North American auto industry. Then came the second wave. Tariffs on steel and aluminum, the building blocks of modern industry, were cranked up from 25% to a staggering 50%. Overnight, the cost of raw materials for Canadian manufacturers skyrocketed. For a small factory owner in Ontario making machinery, this wasn't a geopolitical move. It was a sudden existential threat to their bottom line. But the most insidious part of the trap was the so-called reciprocal tariff. It started as a 10% base levy on all goods, but came with a catch. The White House gave itself the power to raise it higher on any country it deemed to have an unfair trade surplus. It was a loaded gun pointed squarely at Canada. And as if that weren't enough, whispers grew louder of a final devastating blow, a potential 100% tariff on semiconductor chips, a move that would sever the high-tech supply chains connecting Canada to Asia through the US. The message from Washington was clear: we control the game. We can raise your costs, disrupt your supply chains, and choke off your access to our market. The trap was set. All Canada had to do was walk into it. But in Ottawa, Prime Minister Mark Carney and his team were drawing up a different playbook. They knew they couldn't win a head-to-head tariff brawl, so they decided not to play Trump's game at all. Instead, they launched a bold, three-pronged counter-strategy, a great pivot designed not just to survive, but to thrive. The first prong was defense. The government unveiled a 6.5 billion Canadian dollar support package. This wasn't just a bailout, it was a war chest. It provided cheap credit for businesses to retool, funds to help them find new international customers, and enhanced employment insurance to protect skilled workers from layoffs. It was a message to Canadian industry: we will not let you fail. The second prong was a direct, targeted retaliation. Canada announced its own set of tariffs, carefully chosen to inflict maximum political pain on key US sectors while minimizing harm to its own consumers. But it was the third prong that would leave the White House stunned, a radical, long-term pivot of Canadian trade away from its overwhelming reliance on the United States. Carney's plan was to build new economic highways, bypassing the American roadblock entirely. First, he looked south, not to Washington, but to Mexico City. High-level meetings with President Claudia Sheinbaum focused on locking in the North American partnership, coordinating their supply chains to ensure more products met the strict USMCA content rules, making them immune to many of the American tariffs. Next, he looked east across the Atlantic. Canada began an aggressive push to fully implement its free trade agreement with the European Union, CETA. Trade had already jumped 71% since the deal was provisionally applied. Now, a new security and defense pact opened the door for Canadian industries to plug into the massive European defense procurement market, creating a new, stable source of demand. Then, Carney looked west to the fastest-growing economic region on the planet, the Indo-Pacific. A Team Canada trade mission landed in Singapore, Malaysia, and Vietnam, while negotiators worked to finalize a free trade deal with the entire ASEAN bloc by the end of the year. The final piece of the puzzle, and perhaps the most powerful, was buried in the ground. Canada began to leverage its immense reserves of critical minerals, the lithium, cobalt, and nickel that are the lifeblood of the EV, battery, and semiconductor industries. By leading a G7 action plan and signing new tech partnerships with Japan, Korea, and the UK, Canada positioned itself as the stable, reliable source for the building blocks of the 21st century economy, a direct counter to America's threatened chip tariffs. The evidence that the pivot was working came faster than anyone expected. In May 2025, the numbers came in from Statistics Canada. For years, about 76% of all Canadian exports went to the US. In a single month, that number had plummeted to 68.3%. The trade flows were already shifting. The trap hadn't just failed to close, the target had quietly slipped out the back door. But this high-stakes chess match was not without its casualties. On both sides of the border, the promise of politicians collided with the reality of everyday life, and the bill for this trade war was being paid by ordinary people. In Canada, the pivot was a lifeline, but it wasn't instant. For the 600,000 workers in Canada's auto sector, centered in towns like Windsor and Oshawa, the 25% US tariff was a daily terror. A shift cut here, an order canceled there. The future of an entire generation's prosperity was thrown into question. The government's $6.5 billion Canadian dollar aid package wasn't just a policy. It was the difference between a family keeping their home or facing foreclosure. The cost of sovereignty was being measured in sleepless nights in the industrial heartland of Ontario. Meanwhile, in the United States, the tariffs meant to bring jobs back were having the opposite effect. For an American construction company in the Midwest, the 50% tariff on Canadian steel meant the cost of building a new school or hospital just exploded. That cost was either absorbed, crushing their profits, or passed on to taxpayers, making public projects more expensive. For the American family looking to buy a new car, the 25% tariff on parts meant the sticker price was suddenly thousands of dollars higher. The promise of America First felt hollow when you were paying more for everything. The trap, it turned out, had caught American consumers and businesses just as much as its intended target. The dust is now settling on a radically new North American landscape. The White House, stunned by a strategy it didn't see coming, is left with a failed policy and a diminished hand. Canada, while bruised, has been forced to accelerate its own economic destiny, forging new alliances and carving out a new place in the world order out of sheer necessity. The old, comfortable certainty of the US-Canada partnership is gone, perhaps forever. The world's most integrated economic bloc has been fractured, leaving both nations standing at a historic crossroads, facing a future that is more independent, but also far more uncertain. In this new era, can the North American partners learn to win together in a different way? Or is this the beginning of a great divergence that will see them both lose by going it alone?